Happy and healthy New Year to everyone. My first memory of any kind of spiritual encounter was with a tree. I was a kid, maybe 5 years old, and I think my father was trying to teach me that God still talks to us. Maybe not in big, blatant, sea-splitting, bush-burning ways, not in upending nature, but through nature. I think he wanted to put in language my 5-year-old mind could grasp, what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel calls radical amazement, that God is unknowable, but that we could catch a glimpse of the divine through a deep appreciation of God's creatures. And so he pointed out the window to a nearby tree, whose branches were swaying back and forth in the wind. "It's a tree," I said. My father smiled and said, "It's God waving hello." Rosh Hashanah is considered to be the birthday of the world, Hayom Harat Olam, in the words of the prayer we recite throughout our service. Today the world was born. We get this opportunity to start again, to see the world as brand new, not unlike on Simchat Torah, when we finish reading Torah and immediately start over again, hoping to find something new in the same old stories we're so familiar with. What if Rosh Hashanah is like Simchat Torah? Because we've just finished 1 year and immediately get started on the next. We'll leave synagogue and walk out into the same world, passing along the same old streets, parks, and sidewalks we've passed by a million times. But what if we commit to finding something new in all of it this year? To stop and say, I never noticed that before. Not because it's different, but because we are. To watch a tree sway gently in the wind and wave back. Emerson said something amazing about trees, which is unfair because Thoreau was his best friend, and friends shouldn't upstage each other. But after everything Thoreau went through, here's what Emerson said about trees. "The greatest delight which the fields and woods minister is the suggestion of an occult relation between man and the vegetable. I am not alone and unacknowledged. They nod to me and I to them. The waving of the boughs in the storm is new to me and old. It takes me by surprise and yet is not unknown. Its effect is like that of a higher thought or a better emotion coming over me when I deemed I was thinking justly or doing right." Rosh Hashanah takes us back to that primordial moment of creation with all of its infinite possibilities. When we were first faced with the question, what is humanity's relationship to the natural world? Our tradition gives us two very different answers. The first is found in Bereshit, the book of Genesis, chapter 1, and the second, Bereshit, chapter 2, side by side. Chapter 1 says, "Pru orvu umil'u et ha'aretz vechivshuha, urdu bigdat hayam uva'of hashamayim uvachol chaya haromeset al ha'aretz." Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and conquer it, and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and all living things that creep on earth. That paints a certain picture of our place in the world. The world was created for me, which is one of the two slips of paper that the 18th century Polish Rabbi Simcha Bunim says we should always carry around in our pockets. The other slip says, "I am but dust and ashes." Genesis chapter 1 gives us a relationship with nature in line with that first slip. The world is something to be tamed, subdued, and harvested in service of our survival, well-being, convenience, and pleasure. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm from LA, and this will be my first winter in Cleveland. I'm bracing myself for a war against nature, the likes of which I have never known. I will be summoning my inner conqueror and letting him take the wheel. Except he won't be there when I need him most. He'll have left behind a third note in my pocket, which says, "Gone surfing." So on one hand, we could look at human history as the story of humanity versus the elements, and marvel at the way our ships tear through water, our trains traverse the countryside, our planes soar through the clouds, our rockets and satellites orbit space. Or most impressively, how there are toasters now where you can make a setting so the toast is perfectly golden brown. And we should marvel at that. How brilliant is the power of human imagination and ingenuity. How hopeful these tangible examples that nothing is impossible when held against the human spirit. And how decisive our victory against a wild and chaotic world conquered. But then you consider everything we've experienced in just the last couple of months. Canadian wildfires that choked our skies and turned New York orange. Hawaiian wildfire that blazed through Maui and killed 150 people. Earthquakes in Morocco that killed nearly 3,000, and Turkey before that. Flooding in Libya that has killed upwards of 11,000. And all of this brings us to our knees and makes us realize that despite our miraculous feats of engineering, maybe we are not the decisive victors in the war against the earth. Mi ba'esh u'mi b'mayim, who by fire and who by water. In the words of our Unatana Tokef prayer, which seems to ring true somehow every year. That's model number one, V'kif shuha, conquer it. But there's the second model, which comes from Genesis chapter 2 and describes our relationship to nature in much less confrontational terms. V'yikach Adonai Elohim et ha'adam, vayinechu began Eden, la'ovda u'leshomra. And God settled the human in the Garden of Eden to till it and guard it. In this next chapter, we're not told to rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, but to give them names. In other words, we are the gardeners, the stewards, the friends of animals we name. In a way, this is more in line with that second slip of paper. I am but dust and ashes. Aren't I, in the end, just bits and pieces of the same earth I'm meant to conquer? Not separate from it, but composed of the very stuff of it? We are dust, and we return to dust. So which model are we supposed to follow? You may know that the conservative movement has its own lawmaking body. It's our own Supreme Court, so to speak. It's called the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, and it convenes over difficult questions of our time and offers rabbinic responsa, thoughtful and informed guidance for how to be a Jew in the modern world. In 2019, they published a tshuva. Tshuva, as we know, is the central theme of the High Holidays. It means to repent or to return, but it also means to answer. So this is just an excerpt from their answer, their tshuva, to the question of sustainability and humanity's responsibility, relationship with nature. They say Genesis 1 was the story for the first era of human development. But having fulfilled that promise, that mandate, we need another story to guide our next steps. And we have that story in the very next verses of Torah, Genesis 2. In other words, the two models we find in Torah, they aren't contradictory. Rabbis Nina Cardin and Avram Reisner argue they're chronological. They're the two sequential chapters of human development. First, fill the earth and conquer it. It's a charge to Adam and Eve to get moving. And 8 million people later, we have, which is why God doesn't leave it at that. Chapter 2 is le'ovda u'leshomra, till it and guard it. That's the phase we're in now. Sustainability isn't just a nice idea, it's a mitzvah. And yet, we're not doing enough to leave behind a healthy, thriving environment to our children. No freedom from fear of worsening air quality, floods, fire, drought. As a human family, we're falling short in this regard, and we need to do teshuvah. But I think that starts with how we return to look at a single tree. There are two books I read this year which inspired me to return to my roots, to experience God's casual communication with us through the gentle swaying of a tree. The first is called The Overstory by Richard Powers. Much of it takes place during the timber wars of the Pacific Northwest in the late 20th century, where foresters and protesters squared off over what remains of the U.S. old-growth forests. Shockingly, less than 4% of America's old-growth forests remain today. These are home to trees that range from at least 150 years old to older than 300 years. On one side of the timber wars, you have decent, hard-working people just trying to provide for their families, harvesting a renewable resource and planting new young trees to offset losses, playing an important role in fueling American progress and economic stability. On the other side, you have decent, passionate people who argue that the trees marked for harvest are irreplaceable, some older than the United States itself. That these mature trees store way more carbon in their trunks than new trees can, that they are home to endangered species and rare plants that help cure diseases, that they play a key role in nutrient cycling, water purification, and flood control. And beyond their utility to human beings, trees are possessed of a complex and beautiful inner life that most of us never stop to see or hear. What I love most about the book is that this human ideological conflict between industry and conservationism, it's only the backdrop. The real conflict that's explored is between us and the trees. Those are the two sides. And what's challenged is the very premise that we're separate entities at all. One of the characters is a tree-loving scientist, researching the root system of an aspen grove. She's partially deaf, which is ironic because she hears what no one else can. The author writes, "Life is talking to itself, and she has listened in. All the drama of the world is gathering underground, massed symphonic choruses that Patricia means to hear before she dies, and she can hear, louder than the quaking leaves, which side will lose by winning." Judaism could have chosen any of its infinite list of beautiful prayers to be its central creed. It chose the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. It begins with Shema, hear, which is nowhere near as easy as it sounds. Because if we could really hear, we'd better appreciate all the miracles that go into the sprouting of a single blade of grass. It ends with Echad, one. We cannot understand the oneness of God until we've embraced the underlying oneness of all God's creatures. One last passage from the Overstory describes a leaf of grass as, quote, "no less than the journey work of the stars, maize and beans and squash, all growing things alone disclose the wordless mind of God." But it's not about reading the Overstory. It's about reading Torah, which our tradition likens to a tree of life, in a way that helps us deeply and to more deeply appreciate not just the overstory, but the understory, everything going on beneath the surface. It's about reading Psalm 104. Ma rabu ma'asecha Adonai kulam bechokhma asita malah haaretz kinyanecha. How wondrous are your works, God. You made them all in wisdom. The earth is full of your creations. Or Psalm 96. Ya'aloz sadai v'chol asher bo az yirananu kol atzei ya'ar. The fields and everything in them exult. Then shall all the trees of the forest shout for joy. Or Deuteronomy 20:19. When in your war against a city, you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it, you may not destroy its trees, wielding the axe against them. You may eat of them, but you must not cut them down. Are trees of the field human to withdraw before you into the besieged city? Again, conflict here between human beings. It's just the backdrop for what the Torah really wants to explore in this moment, which is the question of our relationship to the natural world. And the question is, Ki ha'adam etz hasadeh? Are trees of the field human? Or more accurately, is a human being a tree of the field? The obvious answer is no. A tree is not an enemy combatant to be felled. But what if that's a standing question we're meant to sit with for a while? Ki ha'adam etz hasadeh? Is a human being a tree of the field? The Shema would have us consider God in the unity of all things. So let's entertain the possibility that humans and trees are more alike than they are different, which is the focus of that second book that really moved me, called The Hidden Life of Trees, recommended to me by our very own Ethan Cohen. It's by Peter Wolleben, he was a forester, and his time out in nature turned him on to the complex beauty of the creature he was harvesting. So he familiarized himself with the science and wrote this book, science which proves that trees talk to each other, that they warn each other of insects, drought, and other threats through chemicals they release into the air or through an underground network of roots and fungus attached to their roots. These fungal connections transmit signals from one tree to the next. He calls it the Wood Wide Web. So trees, in their own way, talk. They also apparently have the capacity to hear. Roots of grass seedlings exposed to a crackling at 220 hertz actually orient their tips in that direction. In their own way, they hear. Shema Yisrael. Trees are social beings who protect each other. That's actually the moment that inspired the author's transformation. He experienced the same world in a new way. He was passing by the same old stump he'd passed many times before as a forester, never paying any real attention until the moment he did. And he noticed strange mossy stones on the remains of a beech tree cut down hundreds of years ago. Except when he looked closer, he realized that they weren't stones at all, but hard old wood pulsing with chlorophyll, meaning somehow this ancient dead stump was still alive. How? The surrounding beech trees were pumping sugar to that stump to keep it alive. Ki ha'adam etz hasadeh? Is a human being a tree of the field? No. But if we both talk, and we both hear, and we both tend to our sick and vulnerable, maybe we're more one than we realize. To be a Jew is to experience the world as a miracle. To celebrate Rosh Hashanah is to say, Hayom Harat Olam, it's never too late to birth a new, better world today. One where we commit to really hearing the oneness of all things, to move from conquering to tilling and gardening and guarding. Because on one hand, the world may have been created for me, but we are dust and ashes. We aren't separate from the earth. We are earth. Hayom Harat Olam. Today the world was born. What if on Rosh Hashanah we don't just commemorate the birthday of the world, we experience it like it's happening now? Today the world was born. It doesn't have to be doomed. Our future isn't set in stone, which means we don't have to be set in our ways either. No one is too far gone to change. We can usher in a new world which is being born today. B'nai Yeshurun is heeding the call of the shofar. We're introducing exciting new initiatives aimed at cultivating a sense of stewardship, tilling, and guarding. And I want to invite you to join our efforts, the efforts of our environmental action team. It's chaired by Laura Vexler as part of our Tzedek committee, chaired by Debbie Auerbach-Brown. And you can come up to any one of us after services if you'd like to get involved. Hayom, today, we're partners with Rust Belt Riders who are helping us bring composting to B'nai Yeshurun. The Bridge, our young professional downtown group, did our own Edgewater Beach reverse tashlich, where instead of casting out, we cleaned up. In just 2 hours, 12 volunteers collected 1,185 pieces of trash, mostly single-use plastics, which amounted to 12 pounds of garbage. We're also partnering with Sacred Grounds to bring native species and local pollinators to our Abraham family courtyard. If you want to literally till and guard the land, please reach out to co-chairs Rachel Schwartz, Tamar Atwell, or to myself. It's not the human ideological debate of how best to balance industry, economics, and environment that I mean to turn our attention to this Rosh Hashanah. It's not even the relative efficacy of composting and beach cleanups, or the question of whether it even makes a difference at all. Those are important questions, but it's backdrop. What I'm hoping we consider is our relationship to the natural world around us. How do we walk through the world differently this year? With radical amazement, with more appreciation for the understory, the hidden inner wonders we rarely stop to notice in our world and in one another. Because the world has so much to tell us, if only Shema Yisrael. Rosh Hashanah reminds us it's never too late to usher in the birth of a new world for ourselves and for our children, Lador Vador. There's a saying that the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. Richard Powers writes, but now, the next best of times is long and rewrites everything. Hayom Harat Olam. Today the world is born. May it be a year of blessing and growth. Shana Tova.